If you aren't redlining, you are not headlining. Have you heard this phrase from the DJ industry before? Well, I'm telling you now, nothing can be further from the truth. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to set your levels right as a DJ. We're going to go through gain and trim, those dials at the top of the mixer, the volume faders, the master volume, everything you need to know so that your music sounds like this rather than this. Let's get into it. For today's tutorial, I am on a CDJ and mixer setup. However, you don't need to have a CDJ setup for this information. If you're using a controller, the information, the rules are exactly the same. All of the controls work exactly the same. For me, it's just easier just to zoom in on a mixer because everything's nicely spread out so that you can get a good visual. I'm also not going to play any music in this tutorial because, quite frankly, I don't want to blow up my speakers. So we're going to rely on the lights as a visual. I am also handheld with my camera today, so hopefully the footage is coming through nice and stable, just so that I can get in nice and close and show you what is going on. Right, first and foremost then, let's talk about trim. This can be called gain on some mixers. It does exactly the same thing. Trim, gain, interchangeable words. On this particular Pioneer mixer, it's called the trim. Now, believe it or not, this actually controls not the volume of music that's being sent to the speakers, but the level of signal coming into that particular channel. So channel 2 here on this mixer is connected to the left-hand CDJ. So channel 2's signal is basically being controlled by this trim dial here. The reason why we have trim in the first place, let's get a track playing. The reason why we have trim in the first place is just because all producers make tracks slightly differently. They master them differently, and as a result, they're all recorded at slightly different volumes. Especially older tracks, they can actually come through quite quietly into the mixer. And so we can use the trim to ensure that you have no fluctuations in the volume, because you're going to be monitoring in your headphones, your in-ear monitors, whatever you use. And the idea of the trim is that it balances out the mix so that the crowd do not see different spikes in level or audio. It's more or less consistent throughout the DJ set. Now, very, very importantly, when it comes to adjusting the trim, bearing in mind this is the input signal, you want it so that you're not hitting the red light. So on this particular track, you also have to bear in mind, and this is very important when you're monitoring with the headphones, you want to bear in mind fluctuations in the track volume. So for example, an intro might not introduce the full kick drum until slightly later on, and obviously kick drums are quite loud. So you want to try and monitor for this, and you want to try and have it so that the whole track does not hit any red lights like it is now. Okay, so just about there, maybe a little bit louder is good. Now, any sound engineers that are watching this will probably say, no, that even that's too loud. You want to be going no more than +0 on the signal. I mean, that is technically true, of course, but for me, I've never had any issues in sound quality when you are just, you know, dancing below the red lights. And it's when you start hitting the red lights, that's when you're going to start distorting that input signal. So the trim is very, very important to get right. And it's very important to set the input signal via the trim versus trying to control it using the volume fader. This volume fader, yes, it controls the volume. However, it is controlling the amount of signal that is actually going over to the master. So it goes via the trim first and then via the volume fader. So if you are clipping this audio, so hitting the red lights is known as clipping or distorting the sound. So this is clipping the audio right now. Even if you have your volume fader set to 2 or 3, you're basically going to be playing a clipped signal or a distorted signal with poor quality very quietly, versus if you have it all the way up the top, you're going to be playing that same signal because this channel fader does not change the level, right? So you're either going to be playing a good or bad signal quietly or loudly. That's all it does. The other benefit of adjusting the trim versus doing it via the volume fader is simply because when you're DJing, you don't really want to be worrying about trying to match tracks, you know, halfway up the volume sliders. If you're just focusing on getting it up to sort of 70% and then mixing out at 70%. So I always say to people, you should see these volume faders as a door. It's either closed or it's open. Closed, open, a bit like when you go into a supermarket. The automatic door doesn't open halfway. It opens all the way or it's closed. And that is the easiest way to mix, because then you don't have to worry so much about, you know, those finite adjustments in the mix there. But yeah, trim is absolutely critical. It monitors, it's almost like the master of the input signal. And as I say, even if you have your trim all the way down, you're not even going to get a signal to play around with on the fader. So trim is there. And as I say, it's critical to get this level right to ensure that you don't get fluctuations in volume for your overall mix. Let's now move on to the master level. So we've done all the adjustments that we need to do here. The master level, rather than controlling the input, is controlling the amount of signal that is being sent out of the mixer and over to the speakers or the amplifiers, okay? And that is where we control it here. It's the master level. It might be somewhere different on your mixer, but it's always around the top or around the middle somewhere. Same rules apply for master. You do not want the master really hitting the red lights. If you really push it on Pioneer mixers, you will even have a clip light. You can see it frantically switching on and off there. That means that you are sending a distorted or bad signal to the amplifiers or the speakers. And the result will be, number one, a bad sound, that muddy, horrible sound that nobody likes. You are going to potentially damage your amplifiers and your speakers. And also, because it's distorted, it's not crisp, you will also risk hearing damage as well. So when it comes to the master level, what you ideally want is you want the trim, of course, on all of your tracks. If you're playing more than one, you want the combined trims to be not hitting the red lights. And then you want your master just to be sort of dancing below the red lights. Now, again, audio engineers will say that you should be really not going above 0. I do think that Pioneer mixers have attenuation built into them. I don't know that for fact, but I have been told by a couple of sources that they do. And I certainly have not noticed any degrade in sound quality above 0. But for me, I always just say, as long as you are staying out of the red, if you're tickling the red a couple of times, you know, because while you're mixing, of course, there's going to be some slight fluctuations in volume. You know, if you're tickling it a tiny bit, then it's probably not going to be a massive problem, but you certainly want to be staying out of the red for the majority of the time. Now, some DJs will say, well, it doesn't really matter what signal I send from the mixer to the sound system because we have a limiter installed. And that might be the case in a lot of nightclubs. There are limiters installed. Basically, a limiter, all it does is it forbids the sound from going above a certain level. And yes, that is probably the case in a lot of venues. However, there's nothing worse than sending a clip signal out of, a little bit like with the trim and the gates here. If you are sending a bad input into the speakers or the amplifier, even if that sound system is limited, you're still going to have a distorted sound. So that is pretty much it when it comes to levels. And I hope that you have found this information useful. Stay out of the red and just know that the trim is the input, the master is the output, and see these as gates, either open or closed. This controls the level of output from the channel over to the master. And throughout the night, you probably do not need to adjust this too much. Maybe as the club gets busier and busier, you know, you might adjust it up a little bit, but you don't need, if you're touching this with every single mix that you're doing, then there is a bit of a problem. Hope that you have found this video useful. Please do give me a thumbs up if you have made it this far. Subscribe if you have not done so already, and I will catch you in the next one.